Hello and welcome to my channel. My name is David Novak. It has been suggested that I do a top 10 video surveying the past year, 2023. I don't think I've read enough to warrant selecting out 10 books, possibly a top 3. I think Mark at Booktime with Elvis has done such a thing. But this video is going to be the opposite of that. I plan to briefly buzz through every single book that I read during the course of the year, speaking very little about it, and then trying to place it into context in my project of becoming a better reader. So this will be the third video in a series of videos that I have done. I did one covering the books which I read in my first year of dedicated reading, 2022. And then I did another video which covered what I called my literary prehistory, the time when I was groping towards becoming a reader, but before I had started noting everything down in a little book. So I have 2 years worth of jottings here. The first big surprise is I did a count and I come up with a total of 60 for 2023. I think that was maybe 3 ahead of what I did for 2022. The numbers are not entirely reliable, and I'll probably go into that a little bit more after I buzz through the books, as I say. So I had let off on 2022 in the middle of The Arabian Nights, which Penguin Books prints in a 3-volume set, and in the middle of The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, which Penguin Books prints in a 3-volume set. And I think just before the close of the year of 2022, I had started on The Decline and Fall. So it really amounts to my having read 2 books from Penguin's Decline and Fall in 2023 and 1 book from The Arabian Nights in 2023. It won't show up here because I notate the books according to when I began the book. So, but even there, as I say, the numbers are not quite revealing. You have short books, you have long books, and although my number count was higher for this year that is just completed, I think I read more substantially in the year previous to that. So the first listing that I have here is a book that I started on the 12th of January, The Conjure Woman by Charles W. Chestnut, a series of short stories which take place in the wake of the Civil War, and they deal with humorous anecdotes, mostly which occurred during the time of slavery. It was a very short book and very enjoyable. It sort of opened the door to short stories, which I did not realize at the time was going to become a theme, but it did. So then on February 5th, I started the last volume of Penguin's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. That would be the last 2 books as Gibbon subdivided them. Then The Arabian Nights, 3rd volume of Penguin, which I started in February. Then I read Orinoco and Other Writings by Afra Ben in the Oxford World Classics. The title story was the best of the volume. I still have an Oxford volume of her plays waiting to go. I'm just not as driven to read plays anymore. I may never get to it. Then I read A Presentiment of Englishry, a book of poems, a slim book of poems, but the poems themselves were substantial in their way. They required a bit of noggin work, by Liam Guylar. And generally, I do not note poetry because I dip into poetry books and read a couple of poems and dip out of them, and anthologies especially so. But in this case, it was a book that I wanted to read from cover to cover, and I did over a couple of days, and so it got a listing. Then the next thing that I read was The Conjure Man Dies, a mystery novel by Rudolph Fisher, possibly the first a detective novel, I guess you would say, with a bit of a noirish feel, by the first African-American writer of detective novels. I believe that's the billing they give it. I don't know if that was true or not. The book was entertaining. In the end, the wrap-up was unsatisfying. Then I read Edward Gibbon and the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, a book about his book. It was from a symposium. I forget, it was 25 years. No, it must have been 100 or something. Some kind of anniversary, 200 years. I don't know what it is. And a bunch of scholars were looking back. And it included essays by the likes of Bernard Lewis and I can't think, so I won't try. There were some good essays in there, and I was at that point starting on BookTube in March. So if you scroll back through my videos, you will find something about it. It was a worthwhile read for me because I got a lot out of Gibbon. Then I read Anne of Green Gables, which I read in the Pantone Penguin or Pantone Puffin edition. I love this edition, which I heard about on the channel of one of my favorite booktubers for a couple of years, and then she dropped out of BookTube and took down, the last I saw, took down almost all of her videos, to my disappointment, but so it is. But that was a case of a book that made me go out. No, don't need you to do that. Made me go out and buy another book in the same series just because I really liked the edition. So I have both of them. But I have not read Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson. Come on, dude. Anne of Green Gables, it started well, and by the end, it was fairly tiresome, but I did enjoy, say, the first half of it. Then I followed it up with a memoir, Notes on a Century by the historian Bernard Lewis, which I enjoyed quite a bit. Many years ago, I read a fair number of Bernard Lewis books. And so if there is a writer or a figure that I have an interest in, then I'm delighted to read a memoir. If it's reading a memoir cold about somebody that I don't really know, I generally don't care for the genre. I have some books here, and he's climbing all over them and knocking the piles, but that's okay. I bring these out, six records of a floating life and As I Crossed a Bridge of Dreams. And you see what I mean about some books being real short. In some video I mentioned, I mistakenly said that this book was a reread. I was wrong. This was the one that was a reread. Both very enjoyable books. 6 records of a floating life only has 4 records of a floating life. That's how these things go. But both enjoyable reads. Then the next thing, and these were also slim volumes, I read the Two Cultures and a Second Look by C.P. Snow, which was, I think, just a lecture he gave or a speech. And that speech was famously rebutted by F.R. Leavis, and his book was from that was titled Two Cultures, and it printed his speech of rebuttal and I think another speech. And in the competition between the two men, Leavis came off the clear winner, the clear-cut winner. Snow came off a little bit of a lightweight, let's say. But I'm realizing that now that I am outside of the literary field anymore, criticism is less to my liking, and I shall probably try to steer clear of it. Now, those 2 videos that I mentioned before will give you a better history of my experience with reading, so I will put those links in the description. Then I read Untouchable by Mulkraj Anand, which was a book that I had sitting around for a long time, and I read it and enjoyed it very much. It's a slim book, something that you can get through pretty easily. I would follow that up by his book Cooley, which was a more substantial book, more characters, more distant locations, and just as good, I think, just as good of a book. The brevity helps Untouchable, as does the striking closure to the book, which puts the book right smack dab into historical events. There's another bookcase over there, and a cat is pulling the books down and dropping them on the floor. It hurts my heart to hear that. Excuse me. Come on. Come on. Don't need you to do that. Pardon me for that. That's how it is around here. And this is how it is as well. After that, I read The Price of Salt, or as it was released in the U.S., Carol, by Patricia Highsmith. I would say it's not the best place to start with Patricia Highsmith. I have the talented Mr. Ripley somewhere. I think Everyman's Library put it out in a volume of 3 Mr. Ripley stories, although there are more than 3 apparently. But I wish I had waited for that. I was not all that smitten with Carol. I mean, I've made videos about all of these, so if you scroll back to my recent reads and look for the author and the title, you can find something about it. The next thing was Women and Economy by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, and I enjoyed quite a bit of it. When she was analyzing the problems, she was quite intelligible and spot on. When she was trying to prescribe what was to be done, she descended to the realm of fancy. I think at some point she had a breakdown, and then she wrote about that in a novella or short story about wallpaper, but I have not undertaken that. Next up was The Memoirs of Hadrian, which I followed by Hadrian, a biography by Anthony Everett. Memoirs of Hadrian was by Marguerite Yourcenar. And neither of the books was particularly satisfying for me. I had had Memoirs of Hadrian on my shelf for, I think, a decade or more than that. And so I was glad to read it. Both books together gave me a feel for the historical Hadrian and Trajan in a way that I'd never had. So I am very grateful for them for that reason. I don't think Anthony Everett, I think he's a popular biographer. I don't think he's a very scholarly one. And so he filled the books with all kinds of conjecture, which probably is unprovable. Then a major highlight of my reading year was a book of short stories by Morgan Talty, The Night of the Living Res. I think I first heard about it on Brian at Bookish, his channel. And it just, I've read so little Native American writing, and I don't set up goals for myself, and so it may well slip my mind, and I won't address that lack this year. I just kind of careen from one thing to another, or ricochet, sort of like a pinball. Okay. The next thing that I tried, I skimmed the whole thing. It was something called All Boys Aren't Blue by George M. Johnson. It doesn't count as a read. I skimmed it, I looked at every page, and I didn't like it. It had a lot of problems, I think. But then I got into Stephen Runciman, and this was another highlight, The First Crusade, and I alternated Stephen Runciman with Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, and that's also a 3-volume set. I have not gotten rid of these as yet, so they're still handy, so I brought them out just so I could show them off once again. So I alternated those and read all 3 volumes. Now I think Runciman's books are pretty clear-cut. Each one is a separate book, and I count them as such. And so in my count, I'm counting each of these as one book, even though I think by Solzhenitsyn's subdivision, it's 7 different books or something like that. It's all imprecise. Some booktubers tabulate the number of pages read. I don't know how anybody does that, but I don't think I could do that. And even if you do, even then again, you've got pages that are densely packed with type and pages that are very loose. So any information you derive from statistics has to be taken with a grain of salt, but it is useful regardless. So after Runciman and Solzhenitsyn, so we're already into August, I read Notes of a Crocodile by Chiu Miao-jin, and then I followed that up by Just As I Am by E. Lynn Harris. Romance is not a genre that I care for. In fact, I'm not a genre reader at all. And that was followed by God's Children Are Little Broken Things by Arinze Ifeakandu. And that was a second highlight, another book of short stories set in Nigeria. And so between that and the Night of the Living Res, I really fell hard for short stories. After that, I read The Age of Innocence by Edith Wharton, liked it. And then I read the second and last book by Chiu Miao-jin, Last Words from Montmartre, which was like an extended suicide note. So it was a bit of a hard read, honestly. That was followed up with The Case of Comrade Tulayev by Victor Serge, translated, dealing with the Stalinist purges and show trials. And it was a very interesting look into the Soviet Union of that time. Please. I followed that up with a Penguin edition of the Epic of Gilgamesh. That's a very short book. And then I turned to short stories with Love in a Fallen City by Elaine Chang. I didn't note the translator here, I usually do. Then Ethan Frome by Edith Wharton. Of the three Edith Wharton books that I ended up reading, I think that would be my favorite because it was so pared down and almost archetypal. After that, I read The House of Mirth by Edith Wharton, and actually both of those I did on LibriVox. I must have hurt my eyes because that's the reason I turned to audiobooks. Then, when I got back to print, I found myself looking at Moses Finley and Politics, another symposium talking about the ancient historian Moses Finley. And Long Way Down was next by Jason Reynolds and Danica Novgorodov. It was a graphic novel. And I think I've realized that the graphic novel is also not a format for me, though I didn't realize it from that book. It's a wonderful piece, a wonderful graphic novel. And in my count, I count it as a book. I don't think I will be looking at too many graphic novels in the future, and I figure it's balanced off by the volume of Edward Gibbon that I read mostly during this year, but that was not counted. Then I read a couple of things by J.G. Farrell. I read The Troubles and The Siege of Krishnapur, and I liked both of them. The books are fairly similar, and his third book in the colonialist trilogy, The Singapore Grip, is a much longer book, and the evening reader, Priscilla, is going to be tackling that soon, I believe. I hesitate because the books felt so similar. In fact, I read something about them which pointed out the similarities in the texts. And it's a very enjoyable read. It was a very enjoyable read, and both books towards the end gave me some moments of hilarity. They were very funny in spots, and that alone made them worthwhile. But I think I will take a pass on reading any more J.G. Farrell for a little bit. Then I read Boulder by Eva Baltasar, translated by Julia Sanchez, I think. And it's a book which lingers in my memory. The settings remain pretty vivid, but the book itself did not appeal to me. It was also a very slim book. I read it in a day, easy enough to read in a day. Followed that by A Month in the Country, which was a lovely story about a guy who's done fighting in World War I and is hired to restore a mural in an old church. And it was a lovely little story. Followed that with more by Eileen Chang, Lust, Caution, a Penguin edition, a compilation of stories. It's also a very slim volume. And followed that with People of the City by Cyprian Acquenzi. And that, you may notice it happens often enough that I like the first part of something and I don't like the second part. or I like the first part, and then with each successive part, my liking for the thing declines. Well, that was the case with this. I really was in tune with the author in the first part, and then the second part, he set up a host of expectations which were not fulfilled in the second part. He was an immensely successful writer, and I may well try something else by him in the future. Then I read Silas Marner by George Eliot, and I like Eliot very much. It's a very slim book, and I picked out, it was not the one I thought I was going to read, and it was an enjoyable story, not particularly outstanding, and it gave me the feel of almost an incomplete work, or a work that was rushed to print without having filled out all of the potential plot developments. It felt like it was a little bit lacking. I think that her final novels, Middlemarch, which I've read, and Daniel Deronda, which I have not read, probably are really more suitable to her, giving her the broad canvas with many characters and situations amongst them. Daniel Deronda may be coming up as probably the next Eliot that I choose to read, but I'm not making any commitments yet. Then I read The Silk Roads by Peter Frankopan. You've heard me lament that book. It was a book with some good information. The selling point of the book was that it was a new history of the world, and on that front, it came up lacking. Then I read Mural by Mahmoud Darwish. I don't follow the news regularly, but I follow people on Facebook and on social media from whom I get the impression that we are living at a time when a genocide is being committed in Palestine by the government of Israel. And so I decided that I should familiarize myself a little bit more with some Palestinian writing, and I picked out Mahmoud Darwish because he wants to knock the camera today, because I felt a poet was the place to start. And that book was very lovely. It's, again, a very short piece, poetry translated, and just 2 poems. And I got the sense that Darwish is a voice to be reckoned with when it comes to, well, I was going to say Palestinian affairs, but I would say just being alive. He seems like a poet of the world. I followed that with Memory for Forgetfulness by him, which was a memoir in prose of the siege of Beirut. I think it was 1982. And it was a poet's prose, meaning it was choppy and seemingly unfocused. But it gave you a good picture of the events, and I did some videos talking about that. There were passages in the book which were just unrivaled, like where he talks about criticism and the critical ability. I followed that with A Small Place by Jamaica Kincaid, and that's a very short book, and I don't know why it took me 4 or 5 days to read. That's one you would think could have been done in a day, but it didn't happen that way for me. And it was all right. I've talked about that. I had just before that read an introduction to I think a book by Daniel Defoe, and every trick that she uses in in a small place. She used in that letter the introduction to Daniel Defoe. It was in the format of a letter to Defoe, I think, telling him not to come. And so all of the novelty had worn off by the time I got to a small place. The letter was delightful. The letter to Daniel Defoe was absolutely delightful. You can find it online if you Google it. And then a small place. It wandered a little bit. Then I read the two books by E.D. Morel, 10 Years of Secret Diplomacy and Truth and the War. And that gave me the first indication that I'm improving as a writer somewhat, because I had read things by him previously, years before, that were just very difficult for me to make my way through, and they seemed very, very clear. Then I read Other Minds by Peter Godfrey Smith. It was my first attempt to delve into natural science. Turns out it's a combination, a hybrid, I guess, of natural science and philosophy, mostly philosophy. But it was a enjoyable read, and it was a book with striking insights, which I will retain forever now, I hope, until my mind goes. So I had my qualms with it, but as I've said, part of the use of becoming a better reader is that you then have more time to read stuff that is imperfect. Everything's imperfect, but some things are more imperfect than others. And it's not a good reason to discount something just because there are faults with it. Then I read Spies in the Congo by Susan Williams. This is all very recent, and that was a delightful story. I recently got the new book about Patrice Lumumba's killing, assassination, and he mentioned that it read like a thriller. I think he in the blurbs on this book, several people said it read like a thriller, and I think that's a selling point for any of these nonfiction works that deal in espionage. I'm hoping to do the Lumumba book this year. Then I read Entangled Life by Sheldrake, and I've posted on these so recently I don't need to go into any detail. I reread Cheaper by the Dozen and The New Industrial State by Galbraith. I showed this. I love the edition, and in my other video, I could not remember the name, Economics and the Public Purpose. I really do hope to get to this. It's an old mass market paperback that had an ad inside of it. Kind of crazy that they did stuff. What's that? The Classics Club. Well, I mean, I don't know if the Classics Club is still going. Then O Pioneers by Willa Cather, and I closed off 2023 with The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. Now I'm going to be reading Huckleberry Finn soon as a buddy read with Hannah of Hannah's Books, and I'm very much looking forward to that. So that was the year, and although my number count was, I think, 3 higher than the year previous, again, you can't really speak much for those numbers, but all in all, the books were a lot less substantial that I read in this past year. A lot of real short books, 100-page book, that sort of thing. And so, I mean, aside from something like the Gulag Archipelago. So I realized that one of the reasons for that was, and I mentioned this in I think, the video I did about the year 2022's reading, that it had been my practice to devote 20 minutes per day to a book that was about American politics, basically, and a little bit drier. So I had read the 2 volumes of Charles Sumner. I had read the 2-volume Library of America set of John Quincy Adams's diaries. And that kind of book, Library of America, volumes of original documents, they're very hard going to read all in a sitting as your exclusive read. And so that 20 minutes a day habit worked well for me. And I gave it up in December of 2022 because actually I had been reading them as I did some light stretching for my back. And in December, I hurt my back pretty severely. And so I was not able to do those light stretchings anymore and wound up doing more hardcore physical therapy where I couldn't read. And so I just let it go. And I think the absence of that 20 minutes a day made my overall reading suffer. So I'm thinking of reinstating that habit of 20 minutes a day. My back is not at 100%, but I'm at a point where I think I can do some perhaps subtle Mackenzie stretches for 20 minutes a day while reading. And I've tentatively, I initially was going to do the 2 volumes of these selections of Johnson, James Weldon Johnson. I have 1 and 2, but now looking at them, they actually look relatively easy and the sort of thing that could be breezed through. That I would have jumped into that directly after Quincy Adams had I not interrupted. And so I've decided, I think, that I will read Henry Adams's History of the United States, which I recently picked up again for a song, along with that Willa Cather volume. And I can't exaggerate how much I came off of the diaries of John Quincy Adams enamored with the man, and I think the whole family. I think Papa John Adams deserves time and attention as well, but I'm going to go with Henry Adams to start and read his history. It covers the Jefferson administration and the Madison administration, I believe. So I think I will try to do that. This is January 1st, and I have not delved into there yet. I did read some of this, but I think I'm going to, it won't be called a DNF. I'll just put it aside for now. And try to get back into that habit. In my video, I disingenuously said that it was because the divided focus didn't work well for me. That is not true. This past month, when I was reading Cheaper by the Dozen and John Kenneth Galbraith and Willa Cather, I found I was able to manage 3 books without problem. So that, I think, is the plan. I would say, judging by the numbers count, that my speed has not picked up for sure. So my number count was a little bit higher. And all of that is subject to what kind of time I have at my disposal also. I have not yet gotten to a point where I get up and dedicate, say, 2 solid hours. And my problem, as far as becoming a reader, remains a bit of laziness and a bit of lack of focus. It's very easy for me to read a paragraph and then just go off and do something else. And I do want to work on that. I think I've said that I probably need a good 5 years of reading before I even consider trying to jack up my speed a little bit, and I still think that's the case. And I'm starting to have thoughts about that the speed at which you approach a text probably needs to be determined by a set of variables, which I haven't figured out. But obviously one of them being if a book is garbage or it's not well written, that's apt to be the kind of book that you should be more able to speed through. Whereas something that's well written, you probably don't want to hasten. So those are my thoughts where I stand this year. I've finished 2 years of what I hope to be a 5-year project. Reading Mark Twain, Tom Sawyer, made me realize that I remain an individual who is not smitten with the act of reading. If I am reading a book that I love, such as, say, the letters of Cicero, then I am all in there. If it's a book that does not grab me to that extent, then I would rather be doing something else. And I don't believe reading itself is a necessary activity in life. Just sitting around does it pretty well for me. So I have not determined to abort this reading project, this goal of becoming a better reader. And I don't know, I have to think a little bit about book selection in the future. How much do I want to tackle old books that have been on my sort of unconscious TBR for decades or whatever, and how much I want to grab after the latest passing fancy on BookTube. And there is a genuine question there because as with the Morgan Talty, some of my most rewarding reads of this past year have been the newer books. So I will leave that there, and in a year's time, assuming that I stick to the reading for another year, I will make another video. Possibly I will try to do some kind of a highlights video, not a top 10 to be sure. Thank you very much for stopping by my channel. Pardon me for jumping in here. There were a few errors, 2 of them minor, that I made in the foregoing that I thought I should correct before releasing this live. One thing was I just misspoke and said I thought perhaps I was improving as a writer. The word that I meant to say was improving as a reader. Another thing was, as sort of an aside, I talked about the book about the assassination of Lumumba, which I hope to read. I heard about that book from Brian at Bookish. He read it and gave a review of it, and it was he who referred to the book as reading something like a thriller. I don't remember the exact words he used, but somehow when I was talking about it, though Brian was in my mind, I actually had not mentioned his name, and so what I said comes off kind of a little bit weird. Another matter, though, which prompted me adding this little addendum is that I forgot to mention the 2 James Baldwin books that I read. If you were counting, you will see that the totals did not add up. So just before I read The Price of Salt by Patricia Highsmith, I read the book that James Baldwin wrote. Actually, I believe it was just an essay, but it has been released as a book. Maybe it was released as a book in his time. It really is not worthy the name of a book. It's a fairly poor essay, but the book about the murders in Atlanta, and I did a video about it somewhere. And then after reading Highsmith, because I had had such a bad taste left in my mouth from that essay, I went on to read the last interview with James Baldwin. It's a book published by Melville House, and it reprints not only the last interview, but three others, the third of which had an important influence on me in my early time with James Baldwin. It may well have been the first thing that I read by James Baldwin. The first three interviews in that book are pretty good, and the last one is somewhat lacking because it is indeed his last, just within a month of his death, and he was not his usual sharp self in his answers to the questions, besides which the questions themselves were not very good. So I just wanted to add this little bit of extra footage to clarify those errors. Thank you very much for stopping by my channel.